Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Josslyn stepped into the dimly lit suite of the Five Poppies Resort, the weight of the mission pressing heavily on her chest. She had spent months training for this moment, preparing for the dangers that came with being a WSB agent, yet nothing could have prepared her for the horror she was about to witness. The suite, usually a haven of calm and serenity, now felt like a trap, a cage holding her prisoner in the darkest of moments. The mission had started with so much promise, but now, standing on the precipice of disaster, she could feel her pulse racing with dread. As she opened the door, her eyes immediately locked onto the unsettling scene unfolding before her. Vaughn, her partner, her trusted ally, was struggling against an unknown assailant. The man, cloaked in shadow, had Vaughn by the neck, his hands wrapped tightly around a thick wire, squeezing with relentless force. Vaughn's feet were barely touching the ground, his body jerking in a desperate, futile attempt to break free. His face was turning red, the veins in his neck bulging as he gasped for air, his hands flailing, unable to reach the weapon hidden at his side. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if the world had slowed down in those few seconds, and Josslyn's mind raced to process the danger in front of her. Fear gripped her, the kind of primal fear that comes when you realize that the world you thought you controlled is slipping away. But Josslyn was no stranger to fear. She had been trained to manage it, to act despite it, to think clearly under pressure. Her instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, her hand went to the gun at her side. Her fingers curled tightly around the handle, the cold metal grounding her in the moment. This was it, her chance to make it right, to save Vaughn. She pulled the gun from its holster with a swift motion, her fingers steady as she aimed at the man who had nearly ended Vaughn's life. Time seemed to slow as she took a deep breath, trying to steady her hands, trying to focus. The sound of her heartbeat filled her ears, drowning out everything else as she locked her gaze on the target. She had been trained for moments like this. She knew the stakes, and she knew how to handle them. But then it all went wrong. In the blink of an eye, her heart skipped a beat as the tension in her arms made her falter. The man shifted his position at the exact moment she squeezed the trigger, throwing off her aim. The bullet flew through the air, but not where she intended. It wasn't the assailant who was struck, it was Vaughn. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, and everything seemed to collapse around her in an instant. The shot rang out, louder than anything she had ever heard, deafening in its finality. She watched in horror as Vaughn's body crumpled to the floor, his face contorted in pain. The blood, dark and heavy, began to pool beneath him, seeping into the carpet, staining everything it touched. Josslyn froze, her mind incapable of processing what had just happened. She had just shot the man she trusted most, the man who had been her partner through every mission, every danger. She had shot him by accident, but it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a betrayal. Her legs shook as she rushed to his side, her heart racing, but her body moved as if in slow motion, weighed down by the gravity of her actions. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his chest, trying to stop the blood from spilling out, trying to save him from the damage she had caused. She could hear his shallow breaths, each one weaker than the last, each one taking him further away from her. She could feel the warmth of his blood on her hands, and it made her stomach turn. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She screamed for help, but the words seemed to choke in her throat. No one was coming. She was alone with the consequences of her mistake. She leaned over him, her hands shaking as she tried to apply pressure to the wound, but every second that passed made it more and more clear that she was losing him. Vaughn's eyes fluttered open, the spark of life still flickering in them despite the overwhelming darkness closing in. He gazed at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and pain, and for a moment, Josslyn thought he might speak. But the words never came. Instead, his eyes locked onto hers, and Josslyn felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his gaze, something he needed to tell her, something she couldn't grasp. She bent closer, desperate to hear him, desperate for anything that might bring him back, that might reverse what she had done. But as she watched him struggle for breath, she knew it was too late. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, but with each passing second, the light in his eyes dimmed. Josslyn could feel his life slipping away, each moment a brutal reminder of her failure. She couldn't stop the bleeding. She couldn't undo what had been done. The man she had worked with, the man she had trusted more than anyone else in the world, was dying because of her. As his breathing became weaker, Vaughn's hand twitched, and Josslyn took it in hers, holding onto him as if doing so could somehow keep him tethered to life. His grip was weak, but he managed to squeeze her hand, as if trying to comfort her in his final moments. The words he could not speak were now clear in his eyes, in the faint but unmistakable pressure of his fingers against hers. There were no more words left to say. No more promises to make. No more missions to accomplish. The only thing left was the haunting silence, the stillness that enveloped them both as Vaughn's life faded away. He was gone, and Josslyn was left alone with the unbearable weight of her mistake. The room was silent, the only sound the faint thudding of her own heartbeat in her ears, growing quieter with each passing second. The man who had been her mentor, her protector, her partner, was gone, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. All that was left was the blood on her hands and the cold, empty silence that filled the room. Josslyn sat there, frozen, her mind numb. She had lost Vaughn, and with him, a part of herself. She would never forget the way his eyes had looked at her in those final moments, the unspoken words that hung in the air between them. She had shot him. She had killed him. And now, she had to live with the consequences of her actions, knowing that she had failed the person who had trusted her the most. But as she sat in the aftermath of her failure, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. There were answers Vaughn had left behind, secrets he had known, dangers he had uncovered, that Josslyn would have to face. She had been thrown into something much bigger than herself, and now, there was no turning back. She couldn't change the past, but she could honor Vaughn's sacrifice by continuing the mission, by uncovering the truth he had tried to protect. The only thing she knew for certain was that this mission was far from over, and she would stop at nothing to see it through. No matter the cost. Josslyn's heart raced as she stepped into the suite at 5 Poppies Resort, her pulse quickening with each step. This mission had been planned meticulously, the stakes high, and her training had prepared her for every conceivable danger. She had been trained to observe, to act decisively, to be ready for any situation that might arise in the dangerous world she inhabited. But nothing in her extensive training, had prepared her for what lay ahead. The moment she opened the door to the suite, she was struck by the eerie quiet. The room was dimly lit, the weak light from the lamp casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. She had expected to find Vaughn waiting for her, perhaps reviewing intel or preparing for the next stage of their operation. What she saw instead stopped her dead in her tracks. Vaughn, her partner and trusted ally, was suspended in the air, his body being held off the ground by a man she didn't recognize. The stranger's hands were wrapped around Vaughn's throat, choking him with a thick wire, squeezing tighter with each passing second. Vaughn's face was turning a sickly shade of red as he struggled to breathe, his hands flailing helplessly at the wire. His feet were kicking the air, but they barely made contact with the floor as the man's hold remained unrelenting. Fear surged through Josslyn's chest, and for a split second, she froze, the horror of what she was witnessing paralyzing her. The breath was stolen from her lungs as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Vaughn, the person she had trusted most, was on the verge of death, and she was the only one who could do anything about it. Her instincts took over. She had no time to waste. Her hand went straight to the gun at her hip, fingers wrapping around the cold metal. She pulled it free in a flash, her aim already instinctively set on the man's back. Her heart pounded in her ears as she took in the scene in front of her, her breath shallow, the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She had been trained for this. She had been trained to act under pressure. She knew the risks, knew the stakes. But nothing could have prepared her for the sheer panic that seized her in that moment. She had one chance, just one chance, to save Vaughn. But in that instant of desperation, her focus faltered. The adrenaline coursing through her veins clouded her judgment, her hands trembling with fear. The gunshot rang out in the quiet room, a sharp, thunderous sound that shattered the silence. The world seemed to slow, and in that moment, everything went wrong. The shot missed its mark. The bullet flew through the air and tore into Vaughn's side instead of the assailant's back. Everything exploded into chaos. The sound of the shot was deafening, reverberating in her ears as she watched in horror as Vaughn's body crumpled to the floor. Blood began to pour from the wound, soaking his clothes, spreading across the carpet in a growing, dark pool. Josslyn's stomach lurched, and the weight of what had just happened hit her like a ton of bricks. She had missed. She had shot the man she was trying to save. Panic flooded her, her chest tightening as she rushed to his side. Her hands were shaking violently as she fell to her knees beside him. She pressed her palms against his wound, desperately trying to stop the bleeding, but the blood kept flowing, a torrent that she couldn't control. Her mind screamed for help, but the words stuck in her throat. She could feel the warmth of his blood soaking into her clothes, but no matter how hard she pressed, no matter how many times she tried to stem the bleeding, it was clear, nothing would work. His breathing was shallow, labored. Each breath he took sounded weaker than the last, and Josslyn could feel her own heart breaking as she watched the life drain from him. She was powerless. All her training, all her preparation, had led to this, and it wasn't enough. She couldn't save him. She had failed him. The seconds felt like hours as she leaned over him, her hands covered in his blood, her mind racing with desperation. Her tears began to fall, but they did nothing to change the reality of the situation. She could see it in his eyes, his life slipping away. He was fading, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. His hand reached weakly toward her, a final attempt to connect, but it fell short, his fingers just inches away from hers. Vaughn's eyes met hers one last time. There was no fear in them, no anger. Just a quiet understanding, a recognition that this was the end. His lips moved, but the words never came. His body was too weak, and the blood loss too severe. But the look in his eyes spoke volumes. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he had left unsaid. His grip on her hand loosened, and Josslyn knew in that moment that she had lost him. He was gone, and all she had left was the feeling of his hand slipping from hers, the weight of the loss pressing heavily on her chest. The world around her felt like it was collapsing in on itself. The noise of the room, the thumping of her own heart, the quiet gurgling of Vaughn's breaths, all of it faded into the background as she stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. She had killed him. Not on purpose, but it didn't matter. The result was the same. Vaughn was gone, and it was her fault. She had failed him. She had failed her partner, her friend, the man who had trusted her with his life. And now, all that was left was the emptiness, the unbearable weight of the responsibility she carried. Her hands trembled as she gently closed his eyes, the finality of the action cutting through her like a knife. She couldn't stay there forever. There was still so much she didn't understand, so many unanswered questions that Vaughn had taken with him to the grave. But as she stood over his lifeless body, Josslyn knew one thing for sure. This mission, this operation, had just turned into something much darker than she could have ever anticipated. And now, there was no turning back. Josslyn's heart raced in her chest as she pushed the door open to the suite at 5 Poppies Resort. The mission was supposed to be straightforward, gather intel, assess the situation, and report back. But as soon as the door creaked open, everything changed. The room that had been a safe space for her and Vaughn to plan their next move suddenly felt like a deadly trap, suffocating her with its darkness and silence. She had been trained for this, drilled into her with countless scenarios in the past. But as she stepped over the threshold, all her training seemed irrelevant. Nothing had prepared her for this. The light from the lamp flickered weakly in the corner of the room, casting long, ominous shadows on the walls. It took only a second for her to realize something was wrong. She had expected Vaughn to be waiting for her, working on the intel they had gathered. Instead, her gaze locked onto the horrifying scene unfolding before her. Vaughn was suspended in the air, his body held off the ground by a man she had never seen before. The assailant's hands were wrapped around Vaughn's neck, using a thick, coarse wire to choke him. Vaughn's body jerked violently, his feet kicking and struggling to reach the ground, but it was no use. His hands were trapped, unable to break the hold the stranger had on him. Josslyn's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. Time seemed to freeze for a brief moment, the horrific image of Vaughn's flailing limbs burned into her vision. The sound of his choked breaths echoed in her ears, and the world around her seemed to go quiet. Every instinct she had told her to act, to do something, anything, but she was frozen in place for a heartbeat too long. This was her partner. The man who had fought beside her through thick and thin, who had always been there when she needed him most. And now, he was fighting for his life, hanging on by a thread. In a flash, the terror took hold of her and the training kicked in. Josslyn's hand shot to her side, her fingers wrapping tightly around the cold steel of her gun. She had been prepared for danger, but the weight of the moment sent a shiver through her. This was Vaughn, her friend, her confidant. She couldn't let him die like this. She couldn't let this man, this stranger, take him from her. Her heart hammered in her chest as she leveled the gun and aimed. She knew the mission: save Vaughn, take out the assailant. Her breathing was shallow, but she tried to steady her hands. This was it. One shot. It had to be perfect. The gunshot rang out, sharp and echoing, a loud blast of sound that filled the room. But in the fraction of a second before she pulled the trigger, the assailant shifted, and Josslyn's aim faltered. She had one chance, one moment to save Vaughn, but in her panic, in her desperation to act, she missed. The bullet sailed past the assailant, and instead of striking him, it pierced through Vaughn's side, the impact so sudden, so violent, that Josslyn's breath caught in her throat. Her stomach twisted as she watched the blood blossom from the wound, staining Vaughn's shirt, the crimson spreading out across the fabric like an ominous sign. The world seemed to stop. Time dragged in slow motion as Vaughn's body collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud. Josslyn's mind was consumed with disbelief, the reality of her mistake crashing down on her like a wave. She had meant to save him. She had meant to stop the threat. But instead, she had shot him. She had shot her partner. Josslyn rushed to his side, her legs barely carrying her as she fell to her knees beside him. Her hands, trembling and soaked with sweat, went straight to the wound, pressing desperately to stop the bleeding. But the blood kept flowing, and no matter how hard she tried to hold it back, she couldn't stop it. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, each one weaker than the last. The life that had always burned so brightly in Vaughn's eyes was dimming, fading away with every passing second. Vaughn, no, her voice trembled, breaking as she desperately tried to keep him with her, to keep him alive. But it was clear that the more she pressed, the more she tried to stop the bleeding, the more futile it became. She could feel his warmth slip away from him, feel the life draining from his body, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. His eyes fluttered open briefly, weakly meeting hers. The pain and confusion in his gaze mirrored the storm inside her, chaos, guilt, helplessness. She could see the agony in his face, and yet, somehow, there was a strange calmness in the way he looked at her. His hand, weak and trembling, reached out toward her, but it was too late. His strength was fading, his fingers barely able to grasp hers. It wasn't a comforting touch. It wasn't a gesture of reassurance. It was a last, feeble attempt to make a connection, to say something, to communicate in the way only someone who knew they were dying could. Her heart shattered as she squeezed his hand in return, but even then, she couldn't stop the inevitable. Her fingers were slick with his blood, her palms pressed to his chest, and yet nothing would work. Nothing could save him now. The sound of his breathing grew weaker, more labored, until there was only the shallowest of gasps left. Vaughn's body trembled once more, but there was no strength in it. No fight. The air around them seemed to grow thicker, suffocating in its stillness. In his final moments, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, unfathomable look that Josslyn couldn't quite understand. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. No last confessions, no final requests. Only silence. His hand fell from hers, slipping lifelessly to the ground, and with that, everything went quiet. The room, which had been filled with chaos and desperation only moments before, was now utterly still. Vaughn, the man she had trusted above all others, was gone. She had failed him. She had killed him, despite every effort to save him. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, the pulse pounding in her ears as she stared down at him. The guilt was unbearable, crushing her from the inside out. She had failed. She had lost him, and there was nothing she could do to undo what had been done. Her hands, still covered in his blood, trembled violently as she sat there, her mind spiraling into a haze of disbelief and horror. She wanted to scream, to shout, to rage against the injustice of it all. But she couldn't. She couldn't move. The weight of what had happened, what she had done, held her in place, immobilizing her. She couldn't save him.